today.
Oh, exciting stuff.
It is. I've got a ton of
I love this thing.
lecture slides and some textbook excerpts
Yeah.
and a few real-world news stories we can kind of tie in here.
Awesome. Yeah, it's all about economics is about understanding the forces that shape our daily lives, really. Everything from why prices go up,
Right.
to how job markets fluctuate, all that good stuff.
Yeah, by the end of this deep dive, hopefully you'll understand a little bit better how the economy works
Yeah.
and how it impacts you.
And us.
And us, exactly.
Yeah, we'll be looking at how governments intervene in markets, how monopolies and oligopolies form, all that.
So let's start with the basics. You know how money's always flowing around? Like you get paid, you go to the grocery store, you spend that money.
Yeah.
That's the circular flow of income.
Right, yeah. Imagine money moving between households like yours and firms, basically businesses. So households provide labor and other resources, and then in return, they get paid wages, rent, interest, and profits. It's a continuous cycle.
It's this big economic dance where everyone's passing money back and forth. But how do we measure it? Have you heard of GDP?
GDP, yeah,
Yeah.
gross domestic product. It's the most common way to measure a country's economic activity. It's essentially the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders. But there's also something called GNP.
GNP.
Yeah, gross
Yeah.
national product.
Okay, so GDP is what's happening here. GNP is kind of taking it a step further.
Yeah, GNP looks at the income earned by a country's residents, even if that income is earned abroad. So it's like the total income generated by the nation's people, regardless of where they are in the world.
That's a subtle difference.
Yeah,
But I guess it kind of shows how interconnected the global economy really is.
it really is.
But have you ever noticed how economies kind of have those periods of boom and bust?
Oh yeah, that's the business cycle. The upswing, expansion, and then the downswing, recession.
It's like riding a roller coaster. Sometimes you're up high and sometimes you're kind of bracing yourself for the drop. And speaking of those ups and downs, there's a pretty interesting relationship between unemployment and inflation, right?
Right, and economists have a name for that, the Phillips curve.
The Phillips curve.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is this Phillips curve?
So imagine when unemployment is low, that means more people are working. They have more money to spend. Demand for goods and services increases. When demand goes up, businesses often raise their prices, and that leads to inflation.
So that suggests that there's a trade-off between keeping unemployment low and keeping inflation under control.
Right.
But I mean, governments try to step in, right?
Absolutely. They try and influence these economic forces.
Okay.
And one of the tools they use is price controls.
Okay, like when EasyJet was pushing for price caps at Stansted Airport, they wanted to limit how much airlines could charge for flights.
Exactly. That's an example of a maximum price control where the government sets a ceiling on prices to protect consumers from being overcharged, especially in markets where there's limited competition.
It's like saying, airlines, you can't charge more than this,
Right.
even if there's a huge demand.
Exactly. But setting a maximum price can have unintended consequences.
How so?
If the government sets the price cap below the natural equilibrium price, it can actually lead to shortages because the quantity demanded will exceed the quantity supplied.
So if the price is too low, more people will want to buy those cheap tickets.
Exactly.
But then airlines may not want to offer flights at that price.
Or be able to, yeah. And on the flip side, governments sometimes intervene with minimum prices. Think about minimum wage laws.
Okay, yeah.
So a minimum price sets a floor on how low a price can go. So in the case of minimum wage, the goal is to protect workers from exploitation, ensure a livable wage.
Okay, so price controls are all about setting boundaries, but governments also step in and try to influence markets in other ways, right?
Absolutely. For instance, think about the European Union's agricultural policies. They often buy up excess supply of agricultural products to support farmers and stabilize prices.
Right, or even like the set-aside schemes where farmers are paid to take land out of production to avoid that oversupply.
Exactly. Or you can think about advertising campaigns. Governments use negative and positive advertising to try and influence our behavior as well.
It's true. Think about the warning labels on cigarette packs,
Right.
trying to discourage smoking.
Yeah, that's negative advertising.
Or like campaigns promoting recycling or eating healthy. That would be the positive side.
Exactly. Governments have a whole toolbox of strategies for trying to manage the economy. But sometimes, markets themselves develop some pretty interesting dynamics.
That's where things like monopolies and oligopolies come in.
Exactly.
And speaking of monopolies, how much bigger of an example is there than Google?
It's a classic example of a monopoly. They control such a vast share of the market, they can essentially set prices and influence the landscape.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to compete with them.
It's really difficult.
What makes it so difficult?
Well, one reason is something called barriers to entry.
Barriers to entry.
Yeah, it could be things like high startup costs, exclusive access to resources, or even government regulations that favor the existing monopoly.
So they can make a ton of profit because they have no competition.
Right.
They can basically charge whatever they want because people don't really have any other options.
Exactly. And economists call that long-run abnormal profit. Profits that are higher than what you'd expect in a more competitive market. And one of the key factors that can lead to monopolies is something called economies of scale.
Economies of scale. Okay. Break that down for me.
So imagine a company like Google that's already massive. As they get bigger and produce more, their average cost per unit goes down. So this gives them a huge advantage over smaller companies trying to compete.
So it's like the bigger you are, the cheaper it is to produce each unit.
Each additional unit, yeah.
So it makes it almost impossible for the little guys to keep up.
Really tough. It's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Okay.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about oligopolies.
Oligopolies.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are they?
So oligopolies are markets where a few dominant firms control most of the market share. Think of the music streaming industry with platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Pandora.
Yeah, you see them constantly trying to one-up each other, right?
All the time.
With new features,
Yeah.
exclusive content, and even personalized recommendations.
That's a classic characteristic of oligopolies, intense non-price competition. They know that if they start competing on price, that could hurt everybody. So they focus on branding, loyalty programs, and product differentiation to attract customers.
But sometimes you see some strange pricing strategies.
You do.
I remember an article about Tesco, the UK supermarket chain. They were charging different prices for the same products in different locations.
That's a great example. They were essentially tailoring their pricing to the specific demographics and competition in each neighborhood, which demonstrates the strategic interdependence between firms in an oligopoly. Each firm's decisions are based on what they think their rivals will do.
So to really understand how these oligopolies operate, we need to get into game theory. Right?
Yeah, game theory helps us analyze strategic decision-making in situations where the outcome of one player's choice depends on the choices made by others.
It's about anticipating your rivals' moves and trying to outsmart them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of the key concepts in game theory is Nash equilibrium.
Okay.
Have you heard of that?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, so it's basically a state of balance where no player can improve their outcome by unilaterally changing their strategy, assuming all the other players stick to their current strategies.
So it's like a strategic standoff where everyone's just doing the best they can given what everybody else is doing.
Exactly. Nobody wants to make a move that could backfire.
That makes sense. This is all fascinating. But I want to bring it back to you, the listener, for a second. How do all of these forces, macroeconomic forces, actually affect your daily life?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract concepts, but this stuff has a real-world implication for everybody.
Yeah, like economic growth. We hear about it all the time.
Yeah.
What does that mean for me?
When an economy grows, it means more job opportunities, potentially higher wages, increased investment in things like infrastructure, education, healthcare.
So economic growth can lead to a higher standard of living.
Right.
But are there any downsides?
There can be. Rapid economic growth can lead to inflation, which means prices rise too quickly, your money doesn't go as far.
Right.
It can strain natural resources and contribute to environmental problems if it's not managed in a sustainable way.
So it's not just about growing the economy no matter what, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about finding that balance between growth and other goals.
Absolutely.
Like environmental sustainability.
Yeah, exactly. And another key concept related to economics is the idea of equity versus equality.
Okay, what's the difference?
It's a good question. It's an important distinction. Equality means everybody gets the same thing regardless of their circumstances.
Okay.
Equity is more about fairness, recognizing that people may have different needs and starting points, and adjusting accordingly.
So it's like acknowledging that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work.
Exactly. A market system, while efficient in many ways, doesn't always lead to equitable outcomes.
So that means that even if the economy is growing, the benefits might not be spread out fairly among all members of society.
Exactly. For instance, if the income gap between the rich and the poor widens, that could mean that a big chunk of the population isn't benefiting from that economic growth.
Okay, so how do economists actually measure income inequality. Can you quantify something like that?
There are several tools they use. One is the Lorenz curve, visually represents income distribution by plotting the cumulative percentage of income earned against the cumulative percentage of the population.
Okay, so if everyone had the same income, the Lorenz curve would just be a straight diagonal line.
Exactly.
But the more it curves, the greater the inequality.
The more bowed out, the greater the inequality.
Exactly.
And then there's the Gini coefficient, which is just a numerical representation of that inequality.
So it's a way to put a number on how evenly or unevenly income is distributed.
Exactly.
Okay, so knowing there's income inequality is one thing, but then how do governments actually try to promote more equity?
Well, they can use things like progressive taxation, where those with higher incomes pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes.
So the idea is to use the tax system to kind of redistribute that wealth from the wealthier to the less wealthy.
Exactly. And then there are things called transfer payments.
Okay.
These are government programs that provide financial assistance to individuals or households, like pensions for the elderly, unemployment benefits, child allowances.
So it's like a safety net for those who maybe aren't benefiting as much from that economic growth.
Exactly. These programs are meant to ensure a basic standard of living for everyone, regardless of their circumstances.
Okay.
But I imagine there's a lot of debate about the best way to promote equity while still encouraging economic efficiency.
Right, because you can't just make everything equal, right?
Right.
There's got to be some give and take.
There's a balance to be struck. Absolutely.
It's about creating a society that's more just and prosperous for everyone.
It's complex.
Yeah.
No easy answer.
No easy answers.
But that leads us to another powerful tool governments use: monetary policy.
Okay, before we get into all the details of monetary policy, let's take a step back. What is money?
Good question. We use it every day, but what is it really?
Right.
Essentially, money is anything that's widely accepted as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value.
So it's not just the bills and coins.
Exactly.
It's anything we can use to buy things, to measure value, and to save for the future.
Exactly, yeah. And when we talk about the money supply, we're talking about the total amount of money circulating in an economy.
Okay.
And central banks, like the European Central Bank or the U.S. Federal Reserve, they have the power to control that money supply.
Okay. How?
One of the primary ways is by setting the base rate.
Okay, base rate.
Yeah, which is the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow money from the central bank.
So this base rate kind of has a ripple effect across the whole economy
It does.
because it influences the rates that banks charge their customers for loans.
Absolutely. If the central bank wants to stimulate economic activity, they'll lower the base rate, making it cheaper for businesses and individuals to borrow money.
Encouraging people to spend and invest, which can boost the economy.
Exactly.
Okay, makes sense.
And if they want to cool down an overheating economy or combat inflation, they'll raise the base rate. Makes borrowing more expensive.
So they're kind of constantly adjusting the temperature of the economy.
Exactly. They're tweaking those interest rates.
Okay, what about things like quantitative easing? I remember hearing that term.
Oh, yeah, QE. That's right, quantitative easing. More unconventional tool used when interest rates are already very low and the economy needs an extra push.
I remember when the European Central Bank was doing that quantitative easing after 2008.
Right.
What does it involve?
So essentially, the central bank injects money into the economy by buying assets like government bonds from financial institutions.
So they're essentially creating more money and using it to buy up these assets.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the idea is that that will increase the money supply, lower long-term interest rates, and stimulate lending and investment. But QE is not without its risks.
Okay, what are some of those risks?
Well, one concern is that it could lead to excessive inflation
Yeah.
if it's not managed carefully. Another risk is that it could create asset bubbles, where the prices of things like stocks or real estate become artificially inflated.
So it's a powerful tool, but you got to use it carefully.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
This has been awesome. We've covered so much from
Yeah.
the circular flow of income to central banks.
Yeah, we've seen how these macroeconomic forces can really impact your daily life
Yeah.
in so many ways.
But we're not done yet. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to be exploring even more. Things like elasticity, how sensitive are consumers to changes in price, all that good stuff.
Stay tuned.
See you then.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Okay, so I think before the break we were talking about elasticity.
We were, yeah.
Can you remind me what that is again?
Yeah, so elasticity in economics really just refers to how responsive one variable is to changes in another variable.
Okay.
So when we talk about price elasticity of demand, we're looking at how much the quantity demanded of a good changes when its price changes.
So if the price goes up and people stop buying it, then the demand for that good is elastic.
Right.
But if they keep buying it, no matter what, then it's inelastic.
Exactly. Think about it this way. Imagine if the price of, like, your favorite brand of coffee doubled overnight.
Would you still buy it?
Yeah.
Or would you switch to a cheaper brand?
I'd probably be tempted to switch to a cheaper brand if the price was that much different.
Right. So that suggests that your demand for that specific brand of coffee is relatively elastic,
Okay.
sensitive to changes in price.
Okay.
But now imagine if the price of gasoline doubled.
Oh, man.
What would you do?
I'd probably still have to, I still got to drive to work, run errands. I'd probably be annoyed, but yeah, I'd probably still fill up my tank.
Exactly. So that's a classic example of inelastic demand. You need gasoline to function in your daily life. So even if the price goes up, your demand doesn't change that much.
Right. Okay.
Now, how do economists actually measure this elasticity? They use a pretty simple formula.
Okay.
It's the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price.
So if the price goes up 10% and demand drops by 5%, you would divide 5 by 10.
Exactly. And that would give you a price of elasticity of demand of negative 0.5.
Okay. And so what does that number tell us?
So the negative sign just indicates that price and quantity demanded move in opposite directions. As the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. But the absolute value of that number tells us how sensitive demand is to price changes.
So 0.5 means demand is relatively inelastic.
Exactly.
Okay.
A 10% increase in price only led to a 5% decrease in quantity demanded.
Okay.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the limitations of these traditional economic models.
Okay. Yeah, I remember from some of the lectures and stuff that, traditional economics, it makes a lot of assumptions about people being perfectly rational.
Right. It assumes that people always make decisions that maximize their own self-interest.
Right. But real life's a little bit messier than that.
A lot messier.
Right. I mean, we're emotional beings. We have biases.
Well, absolutely.
We don't always fit into these perfect economic models.
Exactly. And that's where behavioral economics comes in,
Okay.
combining insights from psychology and economics to better understand how people actually make decisions.
So instead of assuming everyone's like a perfect robot, it acknowledges that we have emotions, we have biases, we have social norms, all those things.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Think about those impulse buys at the checkout counter.
Guilty.
You don't need that candy bar, but
Right.
it's right there staring you in the face,
Yeah.
and you just grab it.
It's like my rational brain knows better.
Right.
But those candy bars they have their way.
They end up in the basket somehow.
They do, yeah.
And behavioral economics can help explain those seemingly irrational choices that we make sometimes.
Okay, so if customers aren't always these rational people, I mean, does that mean these traditional models are just totally useless?
Not at all. They still provide a really valuable framework for understanding, how markets work in general. But it's important to recognize their limitations.
Okay.
It's kind of like using a map to navigate a new city.
Okay.
It gives you a general sense of the layout, but you're going to encounter, unexpected detours or landmarks along the way.
Right. So how do we take those human elements and actually incorporate them into economics?
Well, one approach is to use something called nudges.
Nudges.
Yeah, nudge theory, developed by economists like Richard Thaler.
Okay.
Suggests that we can influence people's choices by subtly changing the context in which those choices are made.
Okay, give me an example. How do you nudge someone without, taking away their freedom of choice?
Okay, so think about retirement savings.
Okay.
In a lot of countries, people have to actively opt in to a retirement savings plan.
Yeah.
But studies have shown that if you automatically enroll people in a plan, unless they specifically choose to opt out, participation rates skyrocket.
So just by changing that default option, you can actually influence people's behavior pretty significantly.
Absolutely. And nudge theory has been applied to all sorts of things, from encouraging organ donation to promoting energy conservation.
It's like you're making the good choice the easy choice.
Exactly. And it recognizes that we can use these psychological insights to design systems that encourage people to make choices that benefit both themselves and society.
Right. Okay, so let's zoom back out again and talk about something called the balance of payments.
Okay.
I always thought that was one of those kind of mysterious things
Yeah.
that economists talk about. Doesn't really seem relevant to normal life.
It's actually more relevant than you might think. Think of it this way. The balance of payments is essentially just a record of all the economic transactions between residents of one country and the rest of the world
Okay.
over a specific period of time. And it has two main parts, the current account and the capital account.
Okay, break those down for me.
Sure. So the current account tracks the flows of goods and services, income, and transfer payments.
Okay.
So it includes things like exports, imports, investment income, foreign aid.
So it's basically like a snapshot of the trade balance.
Exactly. How much a country's selling to other countries versus how much it's buying. Then you have the capital account. Okay.
That tracks the flow of financial capital.
Okay.
Things like foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, changes in reserve assets.
So it's about the movement of money across borders.
Exactly. Who's investing where?
Yeah.
How much money is flowing in and out? And here's a key point. The balance of payments always has to balance out.
Okay, what if a country has a trade deficit?
So any imbalance in one account has to be offset by an opposite imbalance in the other account.
Okay.
So, for example, if a country is importing more goods and services than it's exporting, it has a current account deficit.
Right.
It has to finance that deficit by either borrowing from abroad or attracting foreign investment.
Okay.
And that would show up in the capital account.
So it's kind of like a seesaw. If one side goes down, the other has to come up to keep it level.
It's a great analogy. And understanding the balance of payments is really important for assessing a country's economic health and its relationship with the global economy.
Yeah, so it's like a window into their economic activity, but on a global scale. Exactly. Now, as we've been going through all these economic concepts, it's important to remember that, these theories are just simplified models of reality.
Right. They're great for the big picture. They don't really capture all the nuance and complexity of the real world.
Of course not. And one of the challenges in economics is applying these theoretical frameworks to the messy reality of human behavior.
Right.
Market dynamics,
Right.
global economic forces. It requires critical thinking, a willingness to question assumptions, and just an appreciation for the complexity of our interconnected world.
Speaking of questioning assumptions, I know we were talking about GDP before. I remember from, I think it was one of the textbooks, that even GDP has its limitations.
Oh, absolutely.
It doesn't really capture everything that contributes to a society's well-being.
No, GDP is a great measure of economic activity, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't account for things like income inequality, environmental sustainability, or even the value of unpaid work like childcare or volunteering.
So if GDP isn't like the end-all, be-all of economic progress, what are some other ways we can measure a society's well-being?
Well, there's been a growing movement toward developing alternative measures
Okay.
that take into account a wider range of factors. So, for example, you have the Human Development Index. The HDI
Okay.
incorporates life expectancy, education levels, and income. And then you have the Genuine Progress Indicator, the GPI, factors in things like environmental and social costs.
So it's about more than just like growing the economy and having a bunch of money.
Yeah.
It's about creating a society where people are living these long, healthy, fulfilling lives.
In a sustainable way.
Right, in a sustainable way.
Exactly, and that's led to this greater emphasis on the idea of sustainable development, an approach that aims to balance economic growth with environmental protection and social equity.
So finding ways for people and the planet to thrive together.
Exactly. Now, let's bring it back to a more personal level for a moment.
Okay.
How do these macroeconomic concepts relate to your own financial decision-making?
Right, yeah. How does this actually play out in our everyday lives?
It's a great question. And it's something we should all be thinking about. Whether you're considering buying a house, investing for retirement, or just creating a monthly budget. Understanding these macroeconomic forces can help you make smarter financial choices.
Right, so it's like having this insider knowledge
Exactly.
about how the world works.
For example, if interest rates are rising, it might be wise to prioritize paying down your existing debt
Okay.
rather than taking on new loans.
Right.
And being aware of inflation can help you make better decisions about how to save and invest your money.
It's all connected.
It really is. Being financially savvy means understanding the bigger economic picture.
Exactly. Economics isn't just about these abstract theories. It's a tool for navigating the real world.
Yep.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're in the home stretch now, wrapping up our exploration of macroeconomics and market dynamics. Before the break, we were talking about how understanding these forces can make us all better at managing our money.
It's like having that insider information,
Right.
It helps you make smarter decisions about things like saving, investing, budgeting.
Yeah, it's all about making those smart choices.
Yep.
But I want to zoom back out to the big picture for a second. What are some of the key challenges that people who actually make economic policy, what are they dealing with today?
I think one of the biggest challenges is just trying to manage the conflict between different policy objectives.
Okay.
Governments, they have to make trade-offs all the time. So,
Right.
for instance, policies that are designed to stimulate growth might lead to inflation.
Right. Or maybe trying to reduce unemployment puts pressure on the balance of payments.
Exactly. It's like a constant juggling act, right?
You get all these different balls in the air. You're trying to keep them all going.
Yeah.
Policymakers have to weigh the costs and benefits of every single decision and try to anticipate all these potential consequences.
Right, because every action has a reaction.
It does. Plus, on top of that, they have to deal with political pressures, global economic forces that are constantly changing.
Right. It's a tough job. There's no easy answer, is there?
There really isn't.
Like, what works in one country might not work in another.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about adapting to the situation and finding solutions that are effective but also fair, equitable for everyone.
This whole deep dive has really shown just how complex economics is. And it made me realize, those traditional models, those economic models, they don't always tell the whole story. Like we were talking about before, how economics often assumes people are totally rational.
Right, classical economics, yeah.
But what about, like, altruism? What
Yeah.
about charity? I mean, those don't seem very rational. That's a great point. Those models, they often struggle to explain behaviors that aren't motivated by self-interest. But, as we've been talking about, behavioral economics shows us that humans are way more complex than that.
Right.
We're not just calculating machines. Our decisions are affected by our emotions, our values, our sense of fairness, all those things that traditional economics kind of ignores.
Right, so are we throwing out those old models? Are we starting from scratch?
I don't think it's about starting over. It's more about refining, expanding those models
Okay.
to incorporate insights from, other fields like psychology, sociology.
Right.
It's about recognizing that economics is ultimately a social science. It's about people.
It is. It's about how we interact with each other.
Exactly. Understanding human behavior is absolutely essential to create a more just and prosperous world for everybody.
It's like economics needs that human touch,
It does. It
Yeah.
needs to account for those things that make us more than just economic robots.
More than just consumers.
Exactly. More than just producers. We're people. And it's about understanding how people behave in the real world, not just how we think they should behave.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really enlightening deep dive. I feel like we've covered so much from the very basics, how economies work, all the way to those complex challenges that the policymakers are facing.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway for me is that economics is about so much more than just theories and formulas and numbers. It's about understanding the forces that shape the world, our societies.
Absolutely.
And